In the novel The Giver, the character Jonas has been assigned the role of receiver, and that's sort of the person in training to be the community's future giver. And the giver is the person in the community who knows history, who knows about all kinds of things that no one else in the community knows about. For example, in the community there are no hills, because walking up a hill can be arduous and walking down a hill can also be difficult, and so hills are eliminated. In the community there are no animals, no dogs, no cats. The only animals that exist are stuffed animals. One of the things that Jonah learns as he's with the giver and being trained to be the future giver is he learns about snow, he learns about colors, and he also learns about suffering. One of the things this community has been really devoted to is eliminating complication, eliminating things that are troublesome, eliminating things that are bothersome. And so the concept of suffering doesn't really seem to exist in this community. But the giver knows what suffering is. And one of the things that Jonah sees that helps him begin to gain insight into suffering is not just the killing of an elephant by human beings who kill this elephant to take its tusks. But then Jonah sees another elephant that comes up to the body of the slain elephant and sends up a pathetic cry. And what we know from elephants, from studies of elephants, they seem to have something that looks like emotional lives. They seem to have what looks like a high degree of intelligence. And so we can imagine this body of an elephant. The elephant has been killed by hunters. And all the hunters have taken are the elephant's tusks. And so the body is there. And then the author Lois Lowry goes on to say that now, Jonas in what he's seeing, this film or this review that the giver is giving to him, now Jonas saw another elephant emerge from the place where it had stood hidden in the trees. Very slowly it walked to the mutilated body and looked down. With its sinuous trunk it stroked the huge corpse. Then it reached up, broke some leafy branches with a snap, and draped them over the mass of torn thick flesh, almost like a burial. Finally, it tilted its massive head, raised its trunk, and roared into the empty landscape. Jonas had never heard such a sound. It was a sound of rage and grief, and it seemed never to end. Well, it's a powerful moment in the novel. And what's happening here is that Jonas is in the process of learning about pain that no one else in the community could understand. Of course, kids fall off their bikes in the community, and so they know the pain of a scraped knee, right, or perhaps of a broken bone. But what Jonas is experiencing here is not that kind of pain. He's experiencing the pain that comes with empathy. The empathy that a person could feel as he observes one elephant, in a sense, weeping over the loss of another elephant, and it feels like senseless loss. Of course, we can't know exactly what's going on internally in an elephant, but human beings can empathize. And so Jonas is feeling that sense of empathy. And when he is given the job of, receiver to become the next giver, he's told that his training would include learning about pain of a magnitude that none of us can comprehend. Now, the reason Jonas was given this job within the community, this, the role of giver in training, is because the leaders of the community had seen that he had within himself the capacity to see beyond. He was perhaps a particularly perceptive person, perhaps a particularly deep person. All right, just someone who is just naturally inclined to see, not just to look at things, but to see things, to reflect on things, to wonder about things. Perhaps these traits were identified in Jonas early, and that's why he was chosen for this job. And one of the messages of the novel, and of course this novel is directed at young adults, right? This is literature for youth, but there's a reason this book has been so widely read, not only by young people but by adults, because it conveys important and powerful messages. And one of the messages the book conveys is that seeing the world requires coming to terms in one way or another with suffering. Not necessarily experiencing suffering in one's own life, although most people will experience suffering in one's own life, the loss of someone close, intense physical pain, getting through an illness, something like that. Most people will experience this to one degree or another. But if we really want to see what's going on in the world, if we want to see the world in its complexity and its depth, then that requires grappling in one way or another with suffering. In personal experience, grappling with it psychologically, grappling with it emotionally, grappling with it spiritually. This is the message that I think the author is conveying to young people, that as you're becoming more aware now in life, as you're moving into adolescence and then from there early adulthood, you want to be aware that there's a lot of suffering in the world. It's time to put away childish dreams. Of course we want to be idealistic, we want to be hopeful, but it's time to put behind us childishness and now move to a deeper vision of things. And this requires grappling in some sense with suffering. And so this is why Jonas is given this experience, this difficult experience, where he sees what's happening with the elephant and empathizes with that. I think to get at this in a more philosophical, theological way is to link this idea to something that we see in the Christian scriptures, the New Testament. And there's, Christians have different ways of thinking about suffering. I think most Christians see suffering as kind of an aberration, that, suffering is not the way things are supposed to be. That the world is supposed to be a certain way, but because of human sin, there's suffering. And so suffering is kind of an aberration. And although suffering is with us day to day, it's not really the way things are supposed to be. And then there are others, including myself, who hold, I think, what is probably a minority view. But that view is that no, suffering is not an aberration. That suffering is actually a basic part of the story. That suffering is actually a basic part of the story. And one of the places I look to is this passage in the early Christian writing, the book of Revelation, which is the last book in the New Testament, where we have a reference to the Lamb, which we know from the context is Jesus Christ. We have a reference to Jesus Christ, the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. That is, from the very beginning of time, in some sense, Christ was crucified. From the very beginning of time, Christ was slain. That you have this act of suffering built in right at the beginning. Then we have this interesting passage in Paul's letter to the Colossians. And Paul says that he is filling up in his flesh what is still lacking in regard to Christ's afflictions. The idea that kind of the idea I have in my mind is that there's a certain amount of afflictions, there's a certain amount of suffering that needs to happen. And this is related to Christ somehow. And Christ has the afflictions that he experienced, but Paul, and I think by implication then other Christians, have afflictions that they need to experience, which added to Christ's experience of affliction will complete the suffering that needs to be suffered in this world. Well, I'm not a theologian, and it's not something that I would argue for passionately. It's just a sense that I have that suffering isn't really an aberration, that suffering is a basic part of the story. In any case, that seems to be the idea that the giver's getting at. That this world, as a matter of fact, we can just observe it, involves suffering. And if we're going to navigate this world well, then we need to grapple in a serious way with suffering. Grapple with it intellectually, grapple with it spiritually, grapple with it psychologically, grapple with it emotionally. And there is a certain idea here that as difficult as suffering can be, as hard as suffering can be to get through, obviously, and then of course there are different levels of suffering. Some people experience a kind of suffering that I think most of us would find crushing, right? And so we don't ever want to speak about this in a casual or trivial way. I mean, some suffering that people experience is beyond the comprehension of most other people. But often those people will come through that and they'll say things like, that was awful, and I would never want to experience that again, and I would never wish that on anyone else. But here's what I learned. And they can contribute that learning to the common human experience. Let me give you a trivial example. That when I was 19, like most 19-year-olds, I knew everything, right? I was in the Navy, and I was in another country, and I crossed a bridge across a river, and this bridge connected a U.S. naval base and a city in another country. And when I crossed that bridge, I saw something. I saw a form of suffering that I had never seen before. Now, I'd grown up in a very difficult neighborhood, personally knew 3 guys who were murdered, right? But that was easy to understand because as tough as it was the justice of the streets, right? There's a certain logic of the streets that, you do things, it's going to come back to you. And so even though the place I grew up in was very tough and there was a lot of suffering, that was a kind of suffering that really wasn't very hard to understand. The people who lived there brought it on themselves, right? So that wasn't really a problem. But what I saw on this bridge involved a young child who lived with a degree of suffering that I could never comprehend. And that's really one of the most important moments in my life because it threw me off balance. I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know what to do with what I had seen. It rattled everything I thought I knew about the universe. In theological terms, in spiritual terms. It rattled everything I thought I knew about the universe. And in that sense, psychologically, spiritually, I was knocked off balance. And this was a long time ago. This is, almost 30 years ago. More than 30 years ago, actually. But I never really regained my balance after that. Now, since then, I've seen things that are much more difficult than what I saw on that bridge. But it was, so to say, kind of a loss of innocence, even though, as I say, I had seen some tough stuff in the neighborhood I'd grown up in. But that was not hard to understand because the people in that neighborhood had brought it on themselves. The guys I knew, Frank, Daryl, and Dwayne, who were murdered, I'm sorry that they were murdered, but, they had done things that had put themselves in that situation. It just wasn't hard to understand. But in this case, we're talking about a young child. I'm almost certain it was a young boy experiencing a kind of suffering that I could not imagine. And it was a sort of that disconcerting experience. And as I said, it kind of knocked me off balance, and I've never really regained my balance. If I could go back and run that again, would I do that same experience? And the answer is yes, I would. Because even though, that experience knocked me off balance and has kind of kept me off balance ever since, it let me see something that I had never seen before in a literal sense, sort of looking at something. And then from there, it opened doors to reflecting on things that I never would have reflected on otherwise. And I think that it got me on the path to thinking more deeply and more seriously about really some of the most important questions in life. In that respect, it was easily one of the most important experiences of my life. And also, another thing it encouraged me to do was to ask myself, what can I do to respond? What can I do to respond? Right? You just don't want to leave what you see there and walk off. You want to respond. What can I do to respond? So that was a kind of, maybe a little bit like what Jonah had, although in the story he was, younger than I was when I was on the bridge. But seeing that troubling thing for the first time and being rattled by it, but that becomes an important moment because it opens things up. It conveys to you certain hard truths about the world, right? And if we want to get through this world in the best way possible, engaged in mind, engaged in heart, engaged in soul, then we need to be able to reflect on these things, think on these things. I interview a lot of combat veterans who have experienced very, very difficult things in the world of war. And a number of occasions I've asked combat veterans, even at the end of an hour-long conversation talking about difficult experiences in war, I would ask them, if I had a potion, a magic potion, that I could give you that would cause you to forget all of your bad memories of war, memories of killing, memories of seeing your friends killed, memories of destruction, memories of seeing innocent people whose lives are upended by war. If I could give you a potion that would take away all of those memories, would you drink the potion? Let's say I've asked that question to a dozen combat veterans. Only one has said that he would drink it. And I think in his case, sometimes in the world of war, things get so crazy and out of control that you do things that, that you come to regret so profoundly, that don't take place in actual combat. Let's say you're in a combat situation where you don't know who's friend or foe. It's impossible to tell who's friend or foe. And so that 15-year-old kid over there who's smiling at you, maybe he's friendly, but maybe he was part of that group that was shooting at you last night. You just don't know. And you get to a place where you just hate them all. And then in some certain moment you do something, right, that you cannot legitimately tell yourself was an act of war. It was an atrocity, right? And this happens in the world of war. And I think in this one case, that's what we might be looking at. And so in this one case, I think really what this veteran was hearing was, if I could drink something and forget not only the war and what I saw in the world of war, but also forget the atrocious, unnecessary things I did, I would do that. So I think that was that one case. But all of the others, even those who experienced intense combat and all of the hardship that comes with that, 50 years later, still the difficulty sleeping because of the memories and the nightmares. But what's so interesting is that except for that one, none of the combat veterans said that they would drink the potion. All of them said that they would prefer to keep the memories as difficult as those memories are. Again, I want to be very careful here because I haven't personally experienced much suffering in my life up to this point, and so I don't want to in any way speak casually about it, because when I'm speaking of this, really I am speaking from a disposition of ignorance. But what people who have suffered a lot, what people who have experienced this kind of thing tell me, is that, as tough as it is, and as much as you would not want to experience it again, and as much as you would not wish it on someone else, there is something profound that comes out of it. There's some kind of profound insight that comes out of it. An important lesson in this book, or an important theme that comes up in The Giver, is that, or a suggestion that I think is maybe there in The Giver, is that all of us should strive to acquire what Jonas acquired. And that is the capacity to see beyond. We live in a society that perhaps is not much characterized by deep thought. We live in a society that is very distracted. We live in a society that is easily manipulated. Maybe we should strive to be a little bit more like Jonas, and that Jonas was given this opportunity to exercise his inherent capacity to see beyond. He was chosen to be a giver because he was identified as someone who had the ability to see beyond. But I think probably all of us have the capacity to one extent or another to see beyond. And one of the things that this probably requires is facing suffering, facing it, looking at it, dealing with it, coming to terms with it in a serious way. Serious psychologically, serious morally, serious spiritually.